It was just another busy day at the airport. People hurried to their gates, checking their phones, talking to loved ones, and preparing for their flights. Among the sea of travelers, one stood out. He was tall, dressed in a crisp uniform with badges and insignia that spoke of his status. This was General Michael Johnson, a distinguished officer in the armed forces, traveling for an important meeting that would take him across the country. Despite his many years of service and the respect he had earned, he was just another passenger in the eyes of most people, but he never let that change how he carried himself. He walked towards the first-class boarding line, ready to get on the flight and relax before the next leg of his journey. As he approached the gate, he noticed the first-class attendant, a man in his mid-30s, with a sharp uniform and a bored expression on his face. The attendant glanced at the general and then at his boarding pass. Without saying anything, the attendant stepped forward, blocking his way. "Excuse me, sir," the attendant said, his voice a little louder than necessary. "You'll have to step aside. This area is reserved for first-class passengers." He pointed towards the first-class section of the plane, as if the general had made a mistake. The general smiled, unfazed by the interruption. "I am a first-class passenger," he said calmly, showing his boarding pass. He had traveled in first class many times before, and it was always a peaceful experience. But today, things were different. The attendant looked at the boarding pass and back at the general, narrowing his eyes. There was a brief pause, and then he shook his head. "I'm afraid you're mistaken," he said, his tone cold. "There must be a mistake with your ticket. First class is for paying customers, and you don't look like you belong in that section." The general's smile faded slightly, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm a senior officer in the military. My ticket is valid, and I belong in first class," he said, his voice calm but firm. "If you'll check again, you'll see that I'm in the right place." But the attendant wasn't having it. "I've checked the list," he said, his voice still dismissive. "I don't know how you got a first-class ticket, but I don't think you should be here. I'll have to ask you to move to coach." The general could feel the tension building, but he remained composed. He was used to facing challenges, even from people who were quick to judge him based on his appearance. He knew that sometimes people saw only what was on the outside and didn't take the time to understand the full picture. But that wasn't his problem to fix. He wasn't going to argue with the man, especially not in front of other passengers. Instead, he took a deep breath and calmly explained once more. "I understand you're doing your job," the general said, his voice steady. "But I assure you, I belong here. Please check my information again. There is no mistake." The attendant was visibly annoyed. "No," he snapped. "I've already told you where to go. You don't belong here." The tension in the air grew thick, and the surrounding passengers began to notice what was going on. Some whispered among themselves, uncomfortable with the way the general was being treated. Others glanced nervously at the general, unsure of what would happen next. The general remained calm, standing tall and composed. But it was clear that this situation was quickly turning into something far more significant than just a disagreement over a seat. Just as the situation seemed to be escalating, another voice broke through the tension. A voice that was firm and confident. "Is there a problem here?" It was a calm voice, but with a certain authority that made the attendant stop in his tracks. The attendant turned to look, startled by the unexpected voice. It was a man in a dark suit, standing a few feet away, watching the scene unfold. He looked like he was just another passenger, but there was something in the way he carried himself, something about his presence that commanded respect. The general recognized him immediately. He was one of the senior officers from his military unit. He had met him at several events before. The man's eyes locked onto the attendant, and the air around them shifted. The general could see that the stranger's calm demeanor wasn't a coincidence. There was no mistaking the authority in his voice. "Is there a problem here?" the man repeated, his tone unwavering, almost challenging. The attendant seemed caught off guard. For a moment, he was silent, unsure of how to respond. He glanced at the general, then back at the stranger. No, sir, there's no problem," he stammered, though his voice wasn't as confident as before. He looked unsure of himself now, realizing he had made a serious mistake. The stranger took a step closer, his gaze shifting back to the general, who had not moved a muscle. "It's quite clear there is a problem," the stranger said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "This man is not just any passenger. He is a high-ranking officer in the military. His ticket is valid, and he is entitled to this seat." The general, still calm, nodded his head in agreement. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady as ever. "I don't want to cause a scene, but I do believe I belong in first class, just like anyone else who holds the correct ticket." The attendant shifted uncomfortably, looking around as if waiting for someone to help him out of the situation. He had clearly underestimated the general, but now he found himself cornered. His earlier arrogance had vanished, replaced by a quiet sense of embarrassment. He muttered something under his breath, attempting to backpedal. I'll get a supervisor," he said weakly, turning away. The stranger, who had been observing the whole interaction with a sharp eye, turned to the general. "Don't worry, General. I'll make sure this is sorted out," he said with a reassuring smile. The general didn't respond right away. He didn't need to. He had been in situations like this before. He knew that sometimes people treated him like he was less than what he was, and it wasn't always easy to prove them wrong. But today, he wasn't alone, and that made all the difference. As the attendant rushed off to find a supervisor, the passengers who had been quietly watching the scene began to murmur among themselves. Some exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what had just happened. Others were looking at the general with newfound respect. They had seen how he handled the situation with grace and dignity, even when faced with blatant disrespect. The general remained seated, his posture still straight, his expression calm. He could feel the eyes of the passengers on him, but he didn't let it faze him. He had dealt with far worse in his military career, and this was nothing more than a minor obstacle. But it wasn't just about the seat anymore. It was about respect. A few moments later, the attendant returned with a supervisor, a middle-aged woman in a uniform, who immediately approached the general. The supervisor looked flustered, her eyes darting between the general and the now silent attendant. She recognized the general immediately. He was well known in military circles. "I am so sorry, sir," the supervisor said, her tone apologetic and respectful. "There has been a misunderstanding. This seat is, of course, yours. Please accept my sincere apologies for this mistake." The general nodded politely, not wanting to escalate the situation further. "It's fine," he said, keeping his voice even. "Mistakes happen. Let's just make sure this doesn't happen again." The supervisor nodded and then turned to the attendant, who was still standing nearby, his face red with embarrassment. "You will speak with your manager about this," she told him firmly. "And you'll receive further training on how to handle situations like this in the future." The attendant nodded, clearly ashamed. He had underestimated the general, and now he realized the full extent of his mistake. As the supervisor walked away, the general settled into his first-class seat, finally able to relax. The stranger, who had been watching the entire exchange, smiled at him again. "I'll leave you to it, General," he said, before heading toward the back of the plane. The general nodded in thanks, his eyes following the stranger for a moment. He felt a sense of satisfaction, not because of what had just happened, but because he had stood his ground. He knew that this was just one of many battles, but it was one that had been won with dignity and calm. The atmosphere inside the cabin had shifted. What had begun as a tense moment of confrontation now felt like a quiet understanding was taking place. The general sat back in his seat, his back straight as always, but there was a slight relaxation in his posture. He could feel the subtle weight of the situation lift off his shoulders as the supervisor walked away. Although the situation was now resolved, the general could sense that the passengers around him were still watching. A few whispered quietly to each other, perhaps discussing what had happened. He knew that sometimes these small moments of tension had a way of making others uncomfortable, but he wasn't here to prove a point to anyone else. He had already done that. What mattered now was moving forward. The young flight attendant, still looking uncomfortable, had taken his seat in the back of the cabin. He was likely reflecting on the mistake he had made and what had happened afterward. It wasn't lost on the general that the young man had quickly gone from feeling powerful in his role to realizing how quickly things could go wrong when one made assumptions. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, the general glanced out of the window. He could see the city fading behind them, but his thoughts were focused more on what had happened on the plane than on the landscape below. Despite the initial frustration, the general understood that this moment was a reminder of the importance of mutual respect. He had seen people in positions of authority before, even in the military, act in ways that reflected ignorance rather than wisdom. It wasn't that people didn't know better. It was that they simply didn't care enough to pay attention to others. He knew he had to navigate situations like these with patience, but also with firmness when necessary. The flight was comfortable now. The noise of the jet engines and the hum of the air conditioning filled the cabin, but the general felt his muscles relax as the plane climbed higher into the sky. It wasn't just the altitude. It was the sense that justice had been done, however small the victory was. The young flight attendant, still processing what had just transpired, must have been replaying every moment in his mind. The words he had said, the way he had treated the general, all of it now felt wrong. The general wasn't in the mood for anger, nor did he feel the need to make the attendant feel worse than he already must have. He had been given a second chance to learn from his mistake, and hopefully he would take that lesson with him. The general had heard that flight attendants sometimes underwent sensitivity training to avoid misunderstandings, but not everyone took it seriously. This encounter, in a way, had shown that even those in customer service had much to learn when it came to treating all passengers with dignity, no matter their background. This wasn't about titles, it was about humanity. And at that moment, the general felt grateful that he could embody that idea without losing his own sense of self-respect. As the plane soared through the clouds, the general's thoughts turned to the future. He was a man of discipline, someone who prided himself on standing tall in difficult situations. He couldn't deny the occasional frustration that came from being misunderstood or treated unfairly, but this time, he had been able to maintain his composure. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, more people who would try to judge him based on his appearance or preconceived notions, but he was ready for them. He could hear the soft click of the seatbelt sign as it turned off, signaling that they had reached cruising altitude. The general took a deep breath, settling in for the rest of the flight. He glanced over at the young flight attendant who was now serving drinks to other passengers. The attendant seemed less nervous now, but he avoided making eye contact, perhaps too ashamed to approach the general again just yet. At that moment, the general's mind wandered back to the situation. Despite the unpleasantness of the encounter, he understood how it had unfolded. Sometimes people made mistakes. Sometimes people held on to preconceived notions or acted based on stereotypes. But the most important thing, in the end, was how those situations were handled. The general smiled faintly, knowing that the flight would be over soon. But this moment, this brief incident, would stay with him. It had been a small moment of realization, not just for the flight attendant, but for everyone watching. Respect, after all, was something earned, not something that was given based on appearances. And for the general, he knew that when people treated him as less than, it was up to him to stand firm, as he had today. As the plane continued its journey through the sky, the general's thoughts remained focused on what had just happened. The situation on the ground had escalated quickly, but now, up in the air, things had settled into a quiet rhythm. He sat back in his seat, eyes fixed on the horizon outside his window. The bright blue sky seemed to stretch forever, and the gentle hum of the plane made it feel like they were floating above the world. The flight attendants had returned to their duties, and passengers resumed their conversations or settled into their own thoughts. However, the tension from earlier still lingered in the cabin. The general could sense that some of the passengers had witnessed the confrontation, and they may have been wondering about the details. He didn't mind the attention, though. He had been in situations like this before, and it wasn't the first time he had to confront someone's judgment. But what truly weighed on his mind was the young flight attendant who had made the mistake. He wondered if the attendant realized the depth of his error. It wasn't just about offering the wrong seat. It was about how he had treated a fellow human being. It was about how assumptions based on appearance could cloud one's judgment. The general understood that people could change, but only if they were open to learning from their mistakes. He hoped the flight attendant would reflect on his actions and become a better person because of it. Not long after the plane had reached cruising altitude, a few minutes of calm passed, and the captain's voice came through the intercom, announcing the flight's progress and thanking passengers for their patience. The general took a deep breath and closed his eyes, letting the soothing sound of the captain's voice wash over him. It wasn't that he was angry anymore. He had let go of that feeling. What mattered now was what came next. Then, as if on cue, the door to the cabin opened, and the young flight attendant from before walked in hesitantly. He stood there for a moment, his eyes scanning the rows of seats, before making his way toward the general. His face looked apologetic, and the general could see the weight of his own guilt in his expression. "Excuse me, sir," the young man began, his voice steady but uncertain. "I just wanted to say that I am deeply sorry for how I treated you earlier. I made an assumption, and I shouldn't have. I see now how wrong I was, and I want to apologize." The general looked up at him, his face remaining calm and composed. He had expected this moment. People often needed a bit of time to understand the impact of their actions. It wasn't about holding a grudge. It was about helping others grow. He nodded slowly, offering the young attendant a small but sincere smile. "There's no need to apologize, young man," the general said, his voice calm and understanding. "What matters now is that you've recognized the mistake and learned from it. We all make mistakes, but it's how we choose to correct them that counts. I hope this experience teaches you to think carefully before acting next time." The young attendant nodded, visibly relieved that the general had responded so graciously. "Thank you for your kindness, sir," he said, his voice quiet but grateful. "I truly appreciate it." The general nodded again, then returned his gaze to the window. The interaction had been brief but meaningful. He had offered the young man a chance to grow, and in doing so, had reaffirmed his own belief that kindness and understanding were the keys to bridging gaps between people. It wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. The young attendant lingered for a moment before bowing his head slightly and walking back down the aisle. As he did, the general couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Not for himself, but for the world they all lived in. A world where people could change, learn, and move forward from their mistakes. As the general sat there, he reflected on the journey he had been on that day. It wasn't just about the physical flight. It was about the metaphorical one, the journey of learning and growth. The world was filled with challenges and obstacles, but it was also full of moments like these, moments where people could show kindness, be patient, and make the world a little bit better. With the young attendant's apology behind him, the general felt lighter. He closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself a brief respite before the plane would land. He was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that sometimes it was the small moments of understanding that made the biggest difference. The rest of the flight passed uneventfully, but the general's mind remained focused on the lesson that had been learned. The young attendant's journey of growth had only just begun, but the general was confident that he would carry this experience with him for a long time. The general felt a sense of calm now, but his thoughts couldn't stop wandering back to the situation earlier. It had started with a small mistake, a moment of misjudgment, but it had grown into something much more. As the flight progressed, he reflected on how that small moment had the potential to teach a valuable lesson for everyone involved, including himself. The plane continued its steady course through the sky. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, and for a while, the tension that had once been present had disappeared. Passengers were engaged in quiet conversations, or some, like the general, took the opportunity to rest. But his mind kept returning to the incident with the flight attendant. He thought about the reasons behind the attendant's actions. Could it have been something he had learned from others? Maybe society's pressures had caused him to believe in certain stereotypes. It wasn't an uncommon issue, but it was something that needed to change. The general had seen many things in his career, some good and some bad. But one thing he always believed in was the power of change. It wasn't about labeling people for their mistakes. It was about helping them realize that they could do better. Sometimes, the right course of action wasn't immediately obvious, but the general had always believed that it was his job to help others understand the bigger picture. As the hours passed, the young attendant came back into the general's view. This time, he wasn't hesitant. He stood up straighter and looked directly at the general as he walked toward him. His face was still a little flushed, but there was a new confidence in his step. This time, he wasn't coming with an apology, but with a different kind of message. "Sir, I just wanted to thank you again for your understanding," the young man said, his voice clear and steady. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened earlier, and I realize how important it is to treat everyone with respect, regardless of how they appear. I've learned something today." The general nodded, his expression calm but warm. "I'm glad you understand," he said softly. "It's all about respect. People are often quick to judge based on the way someone looks, but it's important to look beyond that. Everyone has a story, a background that's not always visible at first glance." The attendant seemed to take in the general's words thoughtfully. He stood for a moment in silence before speaking again. "I've always wanted to be better, to be a better person. And I think today was the moment that changed my perspective. I've seen how quick people are to stereotype, but now I understand that I have the power to change that. I'll be more mindful in the future." The general's heart warmed at the words. It wasn't often that someone was able to look at themselves so honestly, but the young attendant had done just that. In a world where many people avoided facing their own mistakes, it was refreshing to see someone take accountability for their actions. "You have the power to make a difference, in your own life and in others' lives," the general replied. "The first step is always the hardest, but it's the most important one." The attendant smiled, grateful for the general's wisdom. He had learned a valuable lesson, one that would stick with him for a long time. As he walked away, he felt lighter, as though the weight of his earlier actions had been lifted off his shoulders. As the plane continued its flight, the general sat back in his seat, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction. It wasn't about proving someone wrong, but about helping others grow. The young attendant had done just that, and it gave the general hope for the future. The world was full of people capable of change, and sometimes all it took was one small act of kindness, one small moment of understanding, to make a world of difference. The rest of the flight passed without incident. Passengers continued their quiet conversations, and the general allowed himself to relax, knowing that the world could always improve, one step at a time. The general had not only helped the young flight attendant, but he had also learned something himself, that kindness and understanding were two of the strongest tools for growth, and he was grateful for that lesson. As the plane continued its steady journey through the sky, the general found himself lost in thought. It wasn't the first time he had been treated unfairly because of his rank or his race, but this situation had been different. There was something about the young attendant's response that stood out to him. It wasn't just the apology. It was the willingness to change, to reflect on his actions, and to grow. The general looked out the window, watching the clouds below as they passed by. He wondered how many other people in the world had similar experiences, moments where they were judged or mistreated, yet had the chance to make a difference. The incident in the plane wasn't just about him or the attendant. It was about the world as a whole. People often acted based on assumptions, and sometimes those assumptions could create misunderstandings that were difficult to undo. But the power to change things rested within each person. He leaned back in his seat, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. As a military officer, He had been trained to handle difficult situations. His life had been full of challenging moments, many of which required him to think quickly and make decisions under pressure. But in this case, the solution hadn't come from authority or force. Instead, it had come from empathy, from understanding that the young man was not malicious, but simply unaware. The general knew that this was how true change happened. It wasn't just about confronting mistakes. It was about offering support, showing kindness, and encouraging growth. It was about helping others recognize their potential to be better. When the young attendant had apologized, he had done more than simply admit to his mistake. He had taken responsibility for his actions and committed to doing better in the future. The general's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a soft voice. It was the flight attendant again, this time approaching his seat with a slight smile. She had a calmness in her demeanor that suggested she was ready to put everything behind her and move forward. "I just wanted to let you know that I've made a note to myself," the attendant said, her voice steady but filled with gratitude. "I'll make sure to remember this moment, not just for today, but for every future interaction I have. It's important to treat everyone with respect, no matter who they are or where they come from." The general nodded. "That's exactly right," he said with a smile. "We all have a responsibility to be better, to challenge the ideas we've been taught, and to choose a better path. You've already started that journey." The attendant's smile widened. "I never realized how easy it could be to treat someone differently just based on their appearance or their role in life. But now I understand that we are all human, and that we are all capable of kindness and respect." The general appreciated her words. It wasn't every day that someone took such a genuine step toward personal growth, and he couldn't help but feel proud of the young attendant. He had learned something that day, something that would stay with him throughout his life. And it wasn't just about his own experiences. It was about the realization that everyone, regardless of their position in life, deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. As the flight continued toward its destination, the general sat back and relaxed. The tension that had filled the air earlier had been replaced with a sense of calm. The incident, which had seemed so troublesome at first, had turned into a moment of learning and understanding. The general knew that he had made a difference, not through force or authority, but through patience and understanding. The young attendant had taken the first step toward change. The general was simply there to guide him. It was a reminder that sometimes it wasn't the big moments that mattered most. It was the small acts of kindness, the words of encouragement, and the willingness to be open to learning. The world could change, one conversation at a time. And as the general closed his eyes and leaned back in his seat, he felt hopeful. The world wasn't perfect, but moments like this showed that change was possible. It started with individuals, each taking responsibility for their own actions and striving to do better. The general was certain that the young attendant had learned a valuable lesson, and he hoped that others would too. The world had the potential to be a better place, one small step at a time. As the plane began its descent, the general looked out the window once again, this time with a sense of peace. The clouds below were painted in shades of orange and pink as the sun began to set, casting a beautiful glow across the horizon. The general thought about how quickly things could change. Just hours ago, he had been caught in a frustrating and uncomfortable situation. Now, he felt a sense of calm and understanding that had been born from an unexpected conversation. The flight attendant had apologized, and in that simple act, she had made an impression that would stay with him for a long time. He admired her ability to reflect on her actions, to understand the mistake she had made, and to genuinely express her desire to do better. He knew it wasn't easy for people to confront their mistakes, but she had done so with humility and respect. That was a rare and valuable trait. As the general thought more about it, he realized how important these small, human moments were. They weren't as dramatic as speeches or grand gestures, but they had the power to change lives. In that moment, the general felt grateful. Grateful for the opportunity to learn, grateful for the chance to meet someone willing to grow, and grateful that the world, despite its challenges, was filled with people who were capable of kindness and change. The general sat back in his seat, a small smile on his face as the plane touched down at its destination. He didn't know what the future held, but he felt more hopeful about it now. As a soldier, he had seen the worst of humanity, but he had also seen moments of incredible courage, compassion, and strength. He had witnessed people rise above their circumstances, change their behavior, and make the world a better place, and he had seen it in the most unexpected of places. After the plane had landed and the passengers began to disembark, the young flight attendant approached the general one last time. This time, her steps were steady, and her expression was one of genuine gratitude. "Thank you again," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I've learned a lot today, and I won't forget this lesson." The general nodded, his smile widening. "We all make mistakes," he said, his voice filled with warmth. "But what matters is what we do after. You've already taken the first step. Keep going." As the general left the plane, he felt a sense of satisfaction. It wasn't just because he had made it through a difficult situation. It was because the world, in that small moment, had been a little bit better. One person's willingness to learn and change could create a ripple effect, and that was something worth hoping for. The general knew that the young attendant would continue her journey of growth, just as he would continue his. Life wasn't about being perfect. It was about striving to be better, day by day, moment by moment. As he walked through the airport, he thought about the future. He thought about how the world could be if more people took the time to reflect, to listen, and to change. It didn't require a grand gesture. Sometimes it was as simple as acknowledging a mistake, offering an apology, and choosing to do better. The general's heart was light as he walked toward the exit, ready for whatever came next. He had learned something that day, a lesson not in power, but in kindness. He had learned that even in the most unexpected circumstances, there was room for understanding and growth. And with that, he felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As he stepped outside into the cool evening air, the general took a deep breath and smiled. The world was far from perfect, but moments like the one he had experienced reminded him that change was possible. It started with one person willing to learn and grow. And that was something worth believing in.